The file begins. Chapter 1. Anatomy of an Exile. The year 2026 did not begin for Andrew Mauntbеттен-Windзor. It ended for him. The verdict was not delivered in a courtroom. It was signed in silence, on palace stationery, with the cold efficiency of a corporate downsizing. Royal Lodge, his home for 2 decades, became a gilded cage from which he was finally evicted. The removal vans that arrived under the cover of a February night looked less like transport and more like a hearse for a reputation already long dead. This was not a fall from grace. It was a methodical erasure. His name scraped from patronages, his presence from the balcony, his future from the line of succession. His world shrank. Then it vanished. Pause. The final humiliation was not the loss of titles, but the loss of place. To be a Windsor is to belong to the land, to the castles, to the very fabric of the kingdom. He was rendered a tenant on his family's estate, a ghost rattling chains in a house that was no longer his. The public did not cheer his downfall. They merely watched with the detached curiosity of a crowd at a demolition. Further collapse was inevitable. It was simply a matter of when. Chapter 2. The Ghost of the Orgy Island. How does a prince born to invincibility become a footnote in a criminal case? The answer is not in the recent headlines, but in the stale air of a private jet decades ago. The name Epstein is not just a name, it is a contagion, a curse written in a little black book that became a digital tomb. For years, Andrew believed his title was a shield. He did not understand it was merely a target. Each handshake, each flight, each shared secret was a thread in the web. He was not the spider, he was the prize specimen, preserved in amber for a later, more public dissection. This scandal has a gravitational pull no one can escape. It does not matter if you are a prime minister or a prince. The shadow of the island, of the townhouse at Gis, of the silent knowing girls, stretches across continents and decades. Pause. It is a posthumous audit of sin, and Andrew's account, it turns out, was deeply in the red. The new files were not a revelation. They were a confirmation of a truth the world already suspected, that behind the palace walls, the rot had set in long ago. To understand the anatomy of this fall, we must first inventory the architecture of his privilege. Andrew was born a spare part. The second son, shielded from the crushing weight of the crown, but still swaddled in its ermine. His youth does not smell of fear or ambition. It smells of polished leather in the cold, institutional air of Gordonstown. He was given a uniform and a war. The Falklands. For a fleeting moment, he was not just a prince, he was a hero, a pilot. His hands were on the controls. This taste of genuine merit, however, would prove to be a fatal poison. It convinced him he was a man of action, not just a man of title, a dangerous illusion. When the gunfire faded, he was given a new role, a working royal, a global salesman for United Kingdom plc. They called him Air Miles Andy. The nickname was a joke, but the reality was a diagnosis. A restless man, insulated by deference his entire life, now let loose upon a world of transactions and temptations. Pause. The palace walls were not a fortress. They were a greenhouse, cultivating a strain of entitlement that could not survive in the wild. The world he was sent to sell to was not the world of his father. It was a new ecosystem of ravenous wealth, where old titles were just another form of currency. And in this ecosystem, there were new predators. The bridge to this world was not a man. It was a woman, Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of a disgraced tycoon, fluent in the language of both high society and low morals. She was the broker. The introduction was not made in a back alley. It was made under chandeliers, on yachts where the champagne was colder than the host's eyes. The friendship with Jeffrey Epstein was a transaction from its first handshake. For Epstein, Andrew was the ultimate acquisition, a royal endorsement for a portfolio of sin. For Andrew, Epstein's world was an escape, a realm without protocol, without bowing, without the suffocating politeness of the court. It was a world of private jets, limitless funds, and an endless supply of people who said yes. He thought he was a guest. Pause. He was an asset. Every flight, every party was an entry in a ledger he never saw, a down payment on a future catastrophe. This was not a friendship. It was the beginning of an indictment. The indictment was not a document served by a man in a cheap suit. It arrived as a whisper, a name from a sealed deposition, now unsealed. Pause. Virginia Giuffre. For the palace, it was initially just another headline to manage, a problem to be contained with a wall of silence and carefully worded denials. The allegations themselves were crude, specific: a townhouse in London, an island in the Caribbean. A teenager passed between powerful men like a party favor. Andrew's first move was not to confront the truth. It was to challenge the process. His legal team, assembled from the most expensive corners of the London bar, built a fortress of procedure. They argued jurisdiction. They questioned timelines. They attacked the accuser's character, painting her not as a victim, but as an unreliable narrator with a financial motive. It was a classic playbook for the powerful. But then came the photograph. The one with his arm wrapped around a 17-year-old's waist, Pause. Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background. His team called it a fake, a digital ghost. Yet it existed. It became a tangible piece of the accusation, a visual anchor for a story the world was beginning to believe. The legal battle was a war of attrition, a slow, grinding siege designed to exhaust the opponent. But every motion filed, every denial issued, was just another shovelful of dirt on a grave he was digging for himself. He was not an isolated case. He was a specimen, a royal exhibit in a wider collection of compromised men. Epstein's network was not a simple pyramid of power. It was a mycelium, an underground web connecting the gilded cages of finance, politics, academia, and aristocracy, a sprawling inventory of sins. There were the financiers who saw Epstein as a cash machine with exotic taste, the scientists who took his money for research, asking no questions about its origin, the politicians who accepted flights and introductions, believing proximity to wealth was the same as power. And then there were the gatekeepers, the socialites, the fixers, the editors who saw everything and reported nothing. They were the enablers, the silent partners in the enterprise. In this ecosystem, Andrew's value was unique. He wasn't the richest, he wasn't the smartest. He was the royal seal. His presence laundered reputations. It turned a sordid gathering into a society event. A trip on a private jet was no longer suspect. Pause. It was a royal engagement. He thought he was borrowing their glamour. In reality, they were mining his legitimacy. The whole structure was designed to protect itself, to sacrifice a limb to save the body. Andrew was becoming that limb, the designated casualty in the anatomy of a fall, while the network itself just mutated, seeking new hosts. And the first limb to be amputated is the one that can no longer bear its own weight. Andrew's defense was not a fortress. It was a house of cards built in a wind tunnel. The evidence wasn't a slow drip. It was a flood that warped the foundations. First, the photograph. The one with Virginia Giuffre's arm around his waist inside Paul Ghislaine Maxwell's London home. His team called it a fake, a digital forgery. But the data doesn't lie. Metadata analysts, like digital archaeologists, unearthed the ghost of the original file. It was real. Then came the alibis, each one a monument to arrogance. The claim of an afternoon at Pizza Express in Woking. An alibi so mundane, so suburban, it was meant to be unimpeachable. It became a national joke, a symbol of a man so detached he believed a family restaurant could sanitize a litany of sin. His most clinical defense was biological. The infamous claim that a rush of adrenaline during the Falklands War left him unable to sweat. A bizarre, unverifiable medical anecdote offered as a shield against testimony of a sweaty nightclub encounter. It was not a defense. Pause. It was a diagnosis of his desperation. Each denial was another shovel of dirt on his own reputation, burying him long before any court could. When the facts become a firing squad, the only option left is to buy the bullets. The civil settlement with Pause, Virginia Giuffre, was not an act of justice. It was a transaction, a cold, corporate merger of legal risk and dynastic survival. The monarchy, the firm, has a long history of managing liabilities. Andrew had become its most toxic asset. The final sum, estimated at millions, was never officially confirmed. That is the nature of such payments. They are designed to purchase silence, not clarity. The source of the funds became the subject of quiet, furious speculation. A loan from his brother, the new king. A grant from his mother, the queen. It was not a family bailout. It was the price of cauterizing a wound that threatened the entire body. The public statement was a masterpiece of calculated emptiness. It contained no admission of guilt. It offered no apology to the victim. It only expressed regret for his association with a convicted sex offender. He was sorry he was caught in the blast radius, not for helping to build the bomb. He did not face a jury. He did not have his day in court. He simply signed a check, and the gears of American justice for him ground to a halt. The verdict was financial. Pause. The sentence was a lifetime of gilded exile. But a gilded exile is still an exile. The check bought silence from one plaintiff, not from the institution he had contaminated. The crown, an ancient and ruthless organism, moved to amputate the diseased limb. This was not an act of familial cruelty. It was an act of corporate survival. Pause. The process was methodical. It was cold. It was the anatomy of an unpersoning. And first, the uniforms, the fabric of his identity, the Grenadier Guards, the Fleet Air Arm, the symbols of a service he had once rendered and 1,000 times since invoked. They were not ripped from his shoulders in a ceremony of shame. They were simply recalled. An administrative note, a quiet phone call. The titles returned to the sovereign, like borrowed library books that were long overdue. Then came the patronages, over 100 of them, schools, charities, hospitals, each one a small thread connecting him to the public realm. One by one, the threads were cut. The palace issued statements. The organizations issued statements. The chorus of repudiation was deafening in its polite, coordinated efficiency. Finally, the core of his status. The three letters that separated him from common men. H.R.H., His Royal Highness. His mother, the Queen, did not strip it. That would have been too loud, too final. Instead, a palace communique announced he would simply cease to use it. The title was not destroyed. It was placed on a high shelf in a dark room to gather dust for eternity. Pause. He was no longer a working royal. He was just royal baggage. And so the file is almost closed. The man who was born a prince became a problem, then a liability, now a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in the cold corridors of power. His story is no longer about one man's appetites or his catastrophic lack of judgment. It is a post-mortem audit of an entire system. It is the story of what happens when privilege, insulated for generations, collides with the unforgiving clarity of a digital world. There is no bunker deep enough to hide from a JPEG. There is no title grand enough to erase a flight log. The monarchy will survive. It always does. It sacrifices a piece of itself to save the whole. An old cold-blooded calculus. But a crack has been left in the porcelain. A permanent stain on the tapestry. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's true sentence was not the loss of titles or the gilded cage of his retirement. Pause. His sentence is to become a footnote, a bitter legacy demonstrating a brutal truth that in the final accounting, not even the blood of a king can buy a different past.